while naming a REST API path, there are some standards that you need to follow. The very first standard is your REST API path should always use nouns but not the verbs. For example, if you are trying to build a REST API that is going to help the client applications to read the user's data or to save the user's data or delete the user's data, for such kind of scenarios, you should always try to use nouns. So who is the noun here? Users is a noun. That's why inside the API path, please make sure you are using the path like users, but not get users, create user, remove user. These are the verbs which should not be used. Instead, we should always use nouns as I highlighted here. In case if someone is trying to fetch all users, they can simply invoke this API. If they're trying to fetch a specific user, after the users, you can accept a request parameter with the user ID or a query param which is going to send the user ID value. Based upon this ID value, your REST API can send a single user response. To create a new user, you can use the same path, but since the client applications, they are going to use the post method to create a new user, the backend application can easily differentiate whether the client application they are trying to invoke this API or this API. If they are trying to read the data with the help of get method, the first API is going to be invoked. Otherwise, if they are trying to create a new data with the help of post method, this third API is going to be invoked. In case if they want to update a specific user, they can follow the same syntax like API/v1/users followed by what is the user ID value. This API is going to be built with the help of HTTP put method. Similar kind of setup you need to follow for delete user as well. The only difference will be the HTTP delete method instead of put method or get method. This is one of the good practice that you need to follow. You may have questions around why we should use this API or V1. I'm going to talk about V1 in few minutes. But before that, let's try to understand why should we use this prefix like API for all our REST APIs. It is a good practice to expose REST API paths with the help of a prefix like API. Instead of only using API, few organizations, they also mention what is the organization like Facebook, followed by API, followed by what is the REST API path. So this kind of prefixes you can always follow, which is going to be common for all kind of REST APIs that an organization is going to build. Now coming to this V1 is going to help us to build our APIs by following the versioning concept. What is going to happen in the real projects is when you start building REST APIs over a time, maybe after 1 year or 2 years, there might be some changes will be introduced inside these REST APIs like adding new fields or changing the request response format or modifying some business logic or deprecating some old features. The change can be anything. When you try to change your existing REST API to a new REST API, it is going to bring some drastic critical changes into your REST API. If you end up maintaining a single REST API, there is a good chance that the existing old legacy client applications may face issues with these new enhancements. That's why to overcome this challenge, APIs they are going to build with the help of API versioning concept. Whatever initial REST APIs that we are going to build, they are going to have V1. In case if you want to enhance your REST API with the new features, you're going to update this V1 to V2. So with that, you will end up having two different type of REST APIs. One is with the V1 version, the other one with the V2 version. The old legacy client applications, they can continue invoking the V1 REST APIs, whereas the new client applications who require some new enhancements, they can happily invoke the V2 REST API. That's a whole reason of maintaining versioning on the REST APIs. Usually this API versioning can be done using 4 different approaches. Let's try to understand what are these 4 approaches. The first approach is to mention the version number inside the URI or inside the REST API path itself, like API/v1/users. This is the most commonly used, and that is what we are also going to follow inside this course. But apart from this path versioning, the versioning details can also accept using request parameters. So here, API/users will be always same, but the clients, they are going to send the version details using a request param. After question mark, they are going to send a param with the name version along with the param value like 1 and 2. Based upon these param value, the backend REST API is going to be invoked. Instead of sending the version details inside the request to param, client applications, they can also send the version details inside the HTTP headers. Usually, when the communication is happening between two applications using HTTP, the metadata of the request will be sent inside the header, and the actual request details will be sent inside the payload or inside the body of the request. Since version details they comes under the metadata information, they can be sent inside the HTTP header as well. Here if you see, someone is trying to invoke this GET API, but inside the HTTP headers, they are trying to send an header with a value. Based upon this header and its value, backend will make sure it is invoking the corresponding version REST API. And the last approach is with the help of content negotiation. While invoking a REST API, client applications, they have an option to send an HTTP header with the name accept. Inside this accept header, client applications, they can mention the schema or the format details of the response structure that they are going to accept. Here, they are trying to mention a format or schema details which has v1. Based upon this accept header content, backend application can decide which version of REST API should be invoked. I hope you're clear about these API versioning approaches. The next standard is around the HTTP status codes that your REST APIs should return to the client application. We know the primary responsibility of the backend REST API is to send the data inside the response. When they're sending these response inside the body of the response, they should also take care of sending the overall status of the request operation. They should give a clue to the client application whether the request processing is successful or failed. Based upon these response status codes, the client applications, they are going to write business logic on their side. For example, if a client application is invoking a GET REST API, the overall status code should have 200, which indicates OK. OK means I'm able to process your request and the data that you're looking, I have sent inside the response body. So that's our whole meaning. We will discuss on how to send the status code technically as well while we are building the REST APIs. For the post REST APIs, the status code should be either 201 or 202. 201 means I have accepted your request and I have created a new data inside the database. Whereas 202 means I just accepted your data and I'm going to process that asynchronously or I'm going to process that in future. For such asynchronous scenarios, you need to send the status code as accepted or 202. For the put, patch and delete REST APIs, you can send either 200 which indicates OK, or you can reply with 204 no content response. For example, if you are building a put or patch REST API which is going to accept the data from the client, but it is not going to send the updated data back to the client applications. In such scenarios, the status code 204 should be used because the REST API is not going to send any content in the response body. Whereas if you are trying to send the updated data inside the response body, the status code 200 has to be used. The same applies for the delete API as well. Whatever status codes that start with 2, they all represent there is something happy or there is something successful happened behind the scenes while processing a request. But for the negative scenarios or for the exception scenarios, you need to make sure you are sending these corresponding status codes. For example, if there is a problem while invoking the request, you need to make sure you are passing the status codes that start with 4. We should return 400 when the input request data is not valid. 401 if someone is trying to invoke without any security. 403 we should send if some client application do not have access to invoke so-and-so REST API. 404 if someone is trying to invoke a REST API that is not available in the backend application. 405 means method not allowed. Method not allowed means if someone is trying to invoke a REST API with an invalid HTTP method. In such scenarios, you can respond with 405. For example, if someone is trying to invoke a put REST API with a HTTP GET method, since the methods are not matching, you can send these method not allowed 405 status code. Coming to the status codes that start with 5, these status codes you should return when there is something bad happen while you are trying to process the given request. When I say process, you accepted that request as a valid data and you started executing the business logic, and inside the business logic there is a problem, there is a runtime exception happened. Under such scenarios, you need to send 500 internal server error for any unexpected runtime exceptions, 503 service unavailable if the server is temporarily overloaded or down due to heavy traffic. These are the few standards that you need to follow while building REST APIs. Of course, there are good amount of more standards as well around performing validations, handling the exceptions, documenting the REST APIs. All these good standards are good practices we are going to discuss in the upcoming sections. For now, I just want to build some REST APIs and establish the connection between our UI and the backend application. That's the goal of this section. As we progress throughout this course, we will definitely discuss all those remaining standards and adopt them inside our application.